Rain hammered the midnight city as a handcuffed billionaire stepped from a black sedan, eyes locked on a small girl beyond wet police tape. The tower above blazed his face, success trembling like neon on rain glass. Officer said, "Keep moving, sir." Reporter said, "Look up, give us a frame." He wouldn't. He stared at the girl clutching a frayed rabbit, its ears dark with rain. Driver said, "Door." The door shut like a verdict, heavy and final. The billionaire's breath fogged and curled around the steel at his wrists. Camera bursts cracked like hail against glass pride. Paramedic said, "Clear a path." The girl's guardian pulled her close, coat flaring, shoulders small and shaking. The billionaire mouthed a question that drowned in sirens. Voice said, "He built an empire, but he couldn't save her." The sentence hung heavier than the storm, and even the machines seemed ashamed. The glass office hung above the city like a clear skull, and the billionaire folded into its silence. He sat on the edge of a leather couch, rain veining the windows with steel threads. Publicist said, "Your statement is drafted." He did not reach for the phone. The magazine cover glowed on a wall screen, celebrating a victory he could no longer name. Assistant said, "We can still shape the story." He stared at the desk where a single cuff hairpin lay like a question. Voice said, "Every fortress has a window." He pressed his thumb to the glass, and the city pressed back with 1,000 indifferent lights. "Security," said, "Car is ready." He whispered to no one, "Not yet." The office hummed cold and tireless, like a watch that had outlived its wearer. In the back seat of a parked patrol car, the child counted raindrops on the window as if they were minutes. Social worker said, "You are safe here." The words floated, light as fog. The rabbit's ear had a seam stitched by a careful hand, and the thread winked under the dome light. Officer said, "We will wait until the call." The child watched blue and red wash the street, like ink spilled across a map. Guardian said, "I'm right here." The city felt too big for 8 years and 1 coat. Voice said, "Not every rescue looks like rescue." The child drew a smiley face in the fog, and then wiped it away, suddenly shy. Far off, a siren rose and fell like a breath the night was holding. Printing presses thundered as headlines found their teeth. Editor said, "Run the late edition." Ink-soaked paper with a face the world thought it knew. A newsstand vendor stacked damp copies, the pages warping like waves. Pedestrian said, "Is it true?" The city did not answer, it only moved. A screen in a cafe looped the same 5 seconds of rain and cuffs. Barista said, "Another shot." A cup steamed into the lens of the world and fogged it. Voice said, "Spectacle devours context." The billionaire's tower dimmed a floor, then another, like a lighthouse losing faith. Somewhere, the child slept at last, small hand still on the rabbit's ear. Dawn scraped the edges of the storm and found the city pale and blinking. The billionaire watched from the office as light replaced sirens. Custodian said, "Morning, sir." He nodded without turning. On a table, a single photo lay face down, curling at a corner. Voice said he built an empire, but he couldn't save her. The words returned softer, heavier, truer. He lifted the photo and did not flip it. The weight of it said enough. Chauffeur said, "They're waiting downstairs." He slipped on his coat, cuffs whispering at his wrist like ghosts of steel. Somewhere below, a small laugh rose from a cafe, bright and unaware. The city exhaled, and the day began to count. The boy learned patience on a plastic chair beneath flickering lights and a humming vent. Leo Arden counted scuffs on the linoleum while his mother rehearsed answers. "Mother," said, "I can work nights, weekends, anything." The manager's smile was trained to look kind and land like a door. Manager said, "We'll keep your resume on file." Leo watched the file cabinet never open. Mother said, "Thank you for your time." Her hands were steady, her eyes weren't. The rabbit in his backpack pressed a seam into his shoulder like a promise. Voice said, he carried her refusals like secret weights. Leo said, One day I'll buy aisles longer than this store. She kissed his hair and chose hope again. The lights buzzed, and the boy began keeping score. Years layered like receipts on a table that never cleared. And Leo Arden grew into long limbs and quiet rage that did homework beside late shifts. Mother said, "Grades first, Leo." He nodded and recalculated rent against wages with a dull pencil. Teacher said, "You're quick with numbers, faster than the test can ask." Pride arrived thin and careful, like steam from a chipped kettle. Doctor said, "We should monitor that cough." The word monitor meant pay later, and worry now. Leo said, "I'll make it cost nothing." He started selling tidy budgets to neighbors who feared envelopes. Voice said, he found order where life refused it. The kettle clicked off, and the night kept its tally. Across the city, ambition learned a different grammar. Cassian Ward memorized the cost of failure from a childhood of thin walls and thinner apologies. Young executive said, "Clients will eat you if you blink." Cassian wore composure like armor and kindness like contraband. Assistant said, "There's a call you've missed 3 times." The pager hummed like a trapped fly against his palm. Cassian said, "Schedule her for next week." He looked at the conference glass and saw only tomorrow's ladder. Voice said, he mistook distance for safety. The elevator doors closed on a life he did not name. The floor numbers rose, and the man who would become cold learned how to freeze. Leo Arden arrived at a glass door where ideas needed badges to breathe. Security said the pitch list is closed. He held a slim deck and the future in his left hand. Student said, "They only listen if they already know you." Leo smiled without humor and traced the seam of the rabbit stitched years ago. Mentor said, "You can send an email like everyone else." He imagined a boardroom that did not confuse manners with merit. Leo said, "Then I'll build the list and the door." The guard looked past him in practiced dismissal. Voice said, "Exclusion trains precision." He turned away, carrying refusal like fuel he would burn clean. Morning found Leo Arden, older, sharper, and unafraid of doors. The headline showed a man in cuffs beneath rain that remembered him. Barista said, "Rough night for the money gods." Leo read and felt the old chair under fluorescent lights return. Mother said, "Be kind, even when they aren't." Her voice lived in him, like a metronome. Analyst said, "Ward Global is untouchable." Leo smiled the way climbers smile at mountains. Leo said, "Then we test the air up there." Voice said, the wound had become a compass. He closed the article and opened a plan, neat as a stitched seam. Outside, the city blinked, and the day measured his resolve. The company began in a rented loft, where midnight smelled like dust and coffee. Leo Arden mapped cash flows on taped paper that crossed the floor. Analyst said, "We need sleep to think." Leo said, "We need truth to win." The server fan sang a thin metallic lullaby that refused to soothe. Mother said on voicemail, "Eat something warm, okay?" He pressed the message to his ear like a bandage. Lawyer said, "Your structure is clean, but costly." Leo said, "Clean is cheaper than scandal." The rabbit's old seam rode his backpack like a remembered oath. Partner said, "We can launch soft and pivot later." Leo said, "We launch clear and climb." The skyline blinked through fogged windows and counted his hours without pity. Voice said, "Every gain will be purchased." He nodded to no one and priced himself in. The loft hummed, the plan sharpened, and the night took its fee. Ward Global answered with the discipline of an army and the mercy of a ledger. Cassian Ward drilled teams until forecasts clicked like gears. CFO said, "We can shield margins if we freeze hiring." Cassian said, "Freeze consequences, not courage." The boardroom glass held his reflection like a witness. PR head said, "Your image is improving, but not your pulse." He loosened his tie and tightened every other screw. Assistant said, "Your son wants dinner." He hesitated, then remembered there was no dinner planned for him. Cassian said, "Reschedule the reschedules." He penciled winds that felt like borrowed air. Voice said, "He is building a barricade against a storm he cannot name." The city moved below, obedient and distant. He watched the quarter turn and felt the cost accrue. The pitch room smelled of citrus, cleaner and expectation. Oh. Leo Arden faced investors who had learned to smile without promises. Partner said, "Walk us through the kill switch." Leo said, "We don't kill, we correct." The model bloomed on screens, neat as a surgeon's map pitewide. Investor said, "Impressive, but you are unproven." Leo said, "So was gravity before it fell." A phone buzzed with a birthday reminder he had forgotten to earn. Friend texted, "Celebrate, even small." He muted it and advanced to risk controls. Mother said by message, "Proud of you, call later." He saw the word later and felt it age. Voice said, "This win will not taste like cake." The term sheet slid across lacquer like a quiet tide. He signed and felt lighter and lonelier at once. Growth arrived as a list of sacrifices disguised as tasks. Leo Arden rewired strategy, rebuilt dashboards, and lost weekends like pennies under cushions. Engineer said, "We can ship the tool by Sunday." Leo said, "Ship, truth not speed." Counsel said, "Ward's defense is meticulous." Leo said, "So is harm when you let it." A dinner reservation expired while his spreadsheet bloomed. Lover said on voicemail, "I can't date a calendar." He stared at the missed calls and muted their ache. Mother said, "I only want to hear your laugh." He tried and heard distance where sound should live. Voice said, "Climbing thins the air." He opened a new tab and felt his lungs agree. The city beat on, patient and indifferent. The first strike was a letter that sounded like law and felt like thunder. Leo Arden published a thesis on Ward Global that counted every blind corner. Analyst said, "This will make enemies." Leo said, "We are not auditioning for friends." The market tilted a fraction, then another. Reporter said, "Is this personal?" Leo said, "Only to the people who pay." The inbox flared with praise that evaporated on touch. Lawyer said, "Expect gloves off." He nodded and braced his ribs. Cassian Ward read the letter and read it again until the words warmed. Cassian said, "We answer with proof, not panic." Voice said, "Wins that don't feel like wins still move the line." The week ended without applause, and the price of resolve rose again. The reveal arrived in a banker's box that looked harmless and weighed like history. Leo Arden watched a paralegal lift a sealed envelope with gloved care. Lawyer said, "This surfaced in discovery from a decades-old trust." Leo said, "Say it clearly." Lawyer said, "Paternity test, sealed by agreement, naming Cassian Ward." The room shrank to the edge of a stapled corner that would not lie flat. Analyst said, "It changes leverage and liability." Leo said, "It changes oxygen." The server hummed as if embarrassed to be present. Investigator said, "The filings link payments to a guardian, then stop." Leo touched the rabbit seam on his backpack and felt the thread bite like proof. Voice said he hunted a giant and found a mirror. Lawyer said, "We can control release or it will control us." Leo said, "No leaks from this room." The box waited patient and cruel while the future rearranged its furniture. The apartment smelled of lemon oil and worry, polished thin. Leo Arden stood in the doorway with the envelope, and his mother folded her hands as if prayer could slow ink. Mother said, "Who sent that?" Leo said, "A past that didn't ask us first." She traced the old seam on the rabbit and closed her eyes. Mother said, "I tried to keep him out of your hunger and your hope." Leo said, "You kept his name out of my mouth." She nodded and took the blame without moving. Mother said, "He offered distance dressed as safety, and I accepted." Leo said, "Cassian Ward is my father." The words landed like furniture dragged over a floor. Mother said, "You are not his mistake." He sat and felt the room tilt toward a cliff. Voice said, "Love can keep secrets that become storms." They breathed together while the city listened at the window and did not judge. In the glass tower, conscience arrived with counsel and refused to wait. Cassian Ward stared at a grainy photocopy that remade the past. Counsel said the document exists and the other party has it. Cassian said, "I told myself distance was mercy." The city glittered like a jury that never slept. Counsel, said silence, will not hold in litigation or in life. He poured water and did not drink it. Cassian said, "I left money and absence and called it protection." The screen reflected a younger face he could not absolve. PR chief said, "If this goes public, story first or story after?" Cassian said, "Truth first, even if late." Voice said, "He mistook power for shelter and found it porous." He closed the folder and felt the tower lean. The night pressed its cool forehead to the glass and waited for him to move. The leak hit like a flare over dark water, and every screen turned to look. "Reporter," said sources confirm a sealed paternity agreement naming Cassian Ward. Commentator said, "Market impact and moral math collide." Leo Arden watched headlines braid his work to his blood. Pair head said, "We respond in 1 hour or never catch up." Mother said on the phone, "You don't owe them your heart." Leo said, "I owe my team the truth and my mother my spine." Cassian Ward stood in a studio hallway and listened to a producer count down a segment about his life. Producer said 3, 2, your live next block. Voice said, the floor dropped and revealed the map beneath. The city refreshed its feeds with a single thumb and called it history. Both men rehearsed sentences that would not stay still. The boardroom gathered like weather around a pressure system that had a surname. Director said, "Conflicts must be disclosed before any vote." Cassian Ward stood straighter as if posture could correct years. Cassian said, "I will step out when required, and I will not step away from truth." CFO said, "Markets want certainty, and they want it yesterday." Leo Arden entered by invitation he earned, and fate amended. Leo said, "My thesis stands on numbers, not lineage." A murmur moved like wind over wheat. Chair said, "We proceed under procedure and under light." Voice said, "Revelation is collapse and foundation at once." The glass trembled with distant helicopters that mistook chaos for news. 2 men faced a table and a mirror, and the room decided to become history. The boardroom filled like a lung before a plunge, and no one wanted the air. Chair said, "We are here to decide stewardship and truth." Cassian Ward stood without notes and faced the glass that had reflected him for years. Cassian said, "I concealed a fact that belongs to this room and to a boy." He let the word father hang, unsentimental and exact. Cassian said, "I recuse from this vote and submit to an independent audit." The directors shifted, hearing numbers and contrition share a sentence. Payad said, "Markets hear intention in tone." Cassian said, "Then hear this. The company is not my alibi." He met Leo's eyes across a table that measured the distance between blood and policy. Voice said, "Confession is not surrender, but it empties the hands." The lights hummed, and the city leaned closer to the glass to listen. Leo Arden rose with a stack of quiet pages and a louder purpose. Leo said, "This proposal is not revenge, it is restraint engineered." He walked the board through controls that removed miracles from earnings. CFO said, "Your plan squeezes margin." Leo said, "It squeezes fantasy first." The risk grid glowed like a lighthouse, cold and useful. Director said, "What of continuity?" Leo said, "Continuity without trust is drift." He cited the workers who built quarters molecule by molecule. Mother's voice lived in his cadence and kept it kind. Leo said, "Give us sunlight metrics, real clawbacks and independence that bites." He did not say father or son. He said duty until the word felt warm. Voice said, "He grew taller without standing higher." The pages settled, and the silence did the math. Deliberation began with paper, but reached cartilage. Director said, "We can accept reforms and retain Cassian, or we pivot to new helm." Another, said public trust, requires visible change. The clock ticked like a metronome for courage. Cassian said, "If the path requires my step back, I will take it." The words were measured like equity and cost the same. Leo said, "Seats for accountability, not for me." He proposed independent oversight and a transition mapped to dates, not hopes. Council said the structure is defensible. The window showed a city that preferred outcomes to speeches. Voice said, "This is the summit where altitude thins excuses." Pens tapped, eyes lifted, and the room prepared to vote on the shape of its future. The vote arrived without music and still shook the walls. Chair said, "On the motion for governance reforms and executive transition." Cards rose like small flags in a private war. The tally favored change by a margin narrow enough to sting. Chair said, "Motion carries." A breath left the room, as if released by a hidden valve. Cassian said, "Effective immediately. I step down as CEO and support the transition." He named an interim independent and endorsed the audit in writing. Leo said, "Our fund will accept board seats with recusal protocols and public metrics." The gavel touched wood like a heartbeat returning. Voice said, "Massive, personal, irreversible." Outside, the market opened its throat and made a sound no one could fully translate. After the vote, the room emptied but the echo stayed. Cassian Ward gathered nothing except his voice. Cassian said, "Leo, your plan is better than my pride." The sentence fit and hurt. Leo said, "Your truth made it possible." They stood in the middle distance between apology and inheritance. Cassian said, "I failed the noun, not the person." Leo said, "I will govern the company, not our history." For a breath, the glass showed them as colleagues and as something else with no word yet. "Chair," said Press is waiting. The men did not hug. They exchanged a nod that meant work and weather. Voice said, "Empires turn on gestures smaller than crowns." They walked to separate doors that led to the same corridor of consequence. The office looked smaller without the title, and Cassian Ward packed it one measured object at a time. Custodian said, "Do you need a cart?" Cassian said, "Only a door that opens both ways." The skyline stared back like a witness relieved to rest. Pierre Head said, "Your statement landed clean." Cassian said, "Clean doesn't mean painless." He placed a photo face down and left it that way on purpose. Assistant said, "Security, we'll deactivate your badge at noon." Cassian said, "Give it 5 minutes early." The elevator chimed with the politeness of a stranger. Voice said he finally paid, in the only currency that mattered. The box was light, but the walk grew long. He pressed the button, heard the cables breathe, and chose to step in. Governance began where speeches ended, and Leo Arden turned clauses into clocks. Auditor said, "We sample real contracts, not summaries." Leo said, "Then start with the ugliest." Operations lead, said workers, "Want time, not slogans." Leo said, "Time first, then trust." The new dashboard lit the wall like weather that finally told the truth. Director said, "Publish the misses with the hits." Leo said, "We are not a museum of victories." Council said, "Clawbacks require teeth." Leo said, "Then sharpen them." Voice said, "Power learned to kneel to measurement." He looked around a room full of people who had outlasted storms and chose light anyway. The clock ticked, and for once it sounded like progress. The apology chose a kitchen, not a stage, and let steam write the preface. Cassian Ward stood inside the doorway and held nothing in his hands. Mother said, "You're late by years, but you're here." Cassian said, "I traded closeness for caution." The kettle clicked and made a small mercy of noise. Mother said, "He learned to need no one because someone taught him." Cassian said, "I taught absence and called it care." He did not sit until she nodded. Cassian said, I am sorry for the shape of the shelter I gave. Well, Mother said he became good anyway. Voice said, some debts dissolve only in witness. They poured tea for the living and left the past thirsty. Outside, the street exhaled and moved on. The program launched where the first refusal once lived, and the door stayed open. Store manager said, You're really funding this. Leo Arden said, Jobs that count, training that pays. Applicants lined the aisle like a river that remembered drought. Our lead said, background friendly, schedule humane. Leo said, we measure dignity in hours returned. A teenager held a pen like a passport. Mother said, you kept a promise to a chair and a child. He smiled and saw fluorescent light look almost kind. Voice said, legacy can be subtraction from harm. The ribbon cut, the cameras clicked, and no one posed long. People filled forms, and the future filled in after them. Evening found father and son on opposite sides of a glass they no longer mistook for armor. Leo Arden said, tomorrow is hard and worth it. Cassian Ward said, I will be useful where silence once stood. The city lit up like charts that finally made sense. Leo said, we report losses like lessons. Cassian said, and love like work. Security said, car is downstairs. They lingered as if time could be kind for one extra breath. Voice said, what they built tonight won't headline, but it will hold. Leo reached out not for a hug, but for a handshake built to widen later. Cassian took it, and the glass reflected two men the market could measure and still misread. The lights blinked, steady and human. The first shareholder meeting under new rules felt like a throat clearing for a city. Leo Arden walked on stage with notes he would barely need. Chair said, we begin with transparency and end with accountability. Leo said, we missed targets here, and we met them here. The crowd shifted, surprised by a ledger that admitted weather and error. Analyst said, explain the variance without excuses. Leo said, labor hours were restored, margins adjusted, trust accrued. Applause came small and honest, the size of truth. Mother sat near the aisle and kept her hands quiet. Voice said, power that kneels stands taller. Cassian Ward watched from a balcony and did not hide. He nodded once, as if answering a question only he could hear. Afternoon settled on a store aisle that once taught refusal and now issued beginnings. Leo Arden toured the program as forms became paychecks. Our lead said, first cohort clears onboarding today. A teenager grinned like sunrise and signed his name in careful strokes. Mother said, keep your break, keep your dignity. Leo said, training pays from hour one. The fluorescent buzz sounded almost kind. Manager said, schedules posted with real notice. Leo said, we honor time before targets. Voice said, sacrifice turned into policy and stayed. He shook hands until his palm ached and felt something soft mend. The rabbit seam in his memory eased, stitch by stitch. Humility rented a classroom where the chalk squeaked like a conscience. Cassian Ward faced a dozen workers learning finance without fear. Instructor said, guest mentor today has made mistakes and returns with math. Cassian said, I confused wealth with safety, and I was wrong. A woman raised a hand and asked about debt like a storm cloud, asking for maps. Cassian said, we start with what is true and spend what is real. Laughter came small, then larger, as worry unclenched. Counselor said, next module, protections and scams. Cassian said, I once believed silence protected. Voice said, a different ledger began to balance. He stayed after class and listened more than he spoke. Night drew a slow curtain and threaded the skyline with sparks. On a quiet terrace, father and son let the city speak first. Leo Arden said, we got through day one of the long years. Cassian Ward said, I will carry days you cannot spare. A distant cheer rose and fell like a market that learned patience. Leo said, We build without burning what holds us. Cassian said, I will show up before I speak. The wind pushed jackets like gentle advice. Voice said, forgiveness is not a headline, but it lights rooms. They stood shoulder to weather, not to win. Somewhere, a door clicked open and did not slam. Morning returned to the boardroom that once judged, and now listened. The chairs waited like instruments tuned for better hands. Custodian said, funny how rooms remember voices. A tour group paused at the glass, and a child pressed her palm to it. Guardian said, just a minute, then school. The child stared at the long table where futures were named. Voice said, legacies are measured by who feels welcome to try. Later, Leo Arden crossed the room and saw the tiny handprint fading. Cassian Ward arrived at the doorway and did not enter. Cassian said, I left the company. He looked toward the hall, then at leonine resolve, and added, but I'm not leaving you.